everyone. Welcome to Art Atrium. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the original custodians of the land, and pay respects to the elders both past and present. This is the first solo exhibition that we have at Art Atrium of Scott Dougall's work. I know of Scott as an artist for a long time, but and then he disappeared from Sydney for a little while, and now he's back. So I've also known Neil Taylor for a long time as well, and you're both fantastic artists, and apparently they know each other also for a very long time. Yeah. Even longer. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we have a series of work, Scott at Cuba, and it's very interesting sort of series of work. But rather for me to talk about it, I'd like you all to welcome Neil Taylor to speak about this exhibition. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. Looks like a dance. I've known Scott since the early 70s. We went to art school together. That's how long ago it is. Prehistoric times. From 1973. Our teacher at art school was William Robinson, who's nowadays a major landscape painter, as you know, but in those days he was teaching us, what was he teaching us? It was Matisse and Bonnard colour theory, basically, sort of preparing us to be modernists somehow or other, which, as you see, didn't happen, you know. So we were supposed to be having a revolution, because the 1970s was all about revolution in various sort of ways. But they were teaching us about a revolution that had happened 100 years before in France, you know, about revolting against the salons and the academies and so on. So Scotty and I sort of, although we were in separate years, weren't we? Both of us left thinking we want to do something else other than this, and strangely enough, everybody who left that particular art school, including Bill Robinson, who's a teacher of us, all did something else afterwards, you know, so I don't know what that was all about. I think perhaps it was to do with the idea that in the 70s there was a lot of, as I said, a revolution. You know, they were marching the streets, Vietnam, and we all had to do something against what we were doing beforehand, and the new things to be doing in those days, because everybody was doing abstraction, everybody was a modernist, everybody was a product of what we were being taught, you know, Matisse, Cézanne, Picasso even, and I think we'd had enough of that, you know, and we'd seen so many exhibitions. When I first came to Sydney, everything was exactly that, abstraction, modernism. There was, I think, one painter, Brian Dunlop, who some of you may know, who was a sort of always an outsider painter, but he was a beautiful realist painter and very successful, did amazing exhibitions all through the 70s and 80s. Can you think of others? I mean,
the only other realist I knew was Jeffrey Smart.
Jeffrey Smart, yeah, well, of course, and he lived in Italy anyway, so, you know, it wasn't really part of the Australian scene at all. Both of us and various other painters at that time were looking for ways to do realist painting. Of course, the other boom that was happening at that time, the other revolution, was the camera photography. And so the way, I mean, I was talking to Scotty the other day, and he reminded me that he's self-taught, and we had to reteach ourselves, basically, how to paint. Ian Grant probably had to do the same thing. Another great realist painter in the room. All of us had to learn out of the camera. When you learn your painting from a camera, you become obsessed with various things about that particular medium. I remember we were taught about Marshall McLuhan at the time. His great motto was, the medium is the message. And strangely enough, the medium of painting is not paint. The medium of painting is light. And so photography sort of, as soon as we started being interested in that, put us right into the mainstream of painting that had been happening for 400 years before, rather than into 20th century modernism. Although we still knew the language of modernism, but it was more about the language of light, which was a much more comfortable place for me personally, and for Scotty, I'm sure, and probably Ian too. Yeah. Any other realists in the room? I don't do notes very well. So that idea of working with light means that you also become obsessed about particular times as well, because light and time, as you know, well, as any physicist, for example, knows, you can't explain one without the other. In particular, light has to be talked about in terms of time, and with painting it's the same. And particularly for somebody working out of a camera. I won't call Scotty a photorealist, because in some ways he is. I don't know, he probably calls himself one.
I call myself a realist, but it's a bit more painterly than
exactly, yeah.
classical photo.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is that his subject is time. If you look around at most of what we've got a lot of, decay, a lot of, what's that word, entropy, a lot of natural, these are subjects that painters use, strangely enough, and it's part of the anomaly of painting. The lights. Part of the anomaly of painting is that you're making something new and fresh, you're adding, you're creating, and yet one of the things you become interested in as a painter is the exact opposite. It's decay, it's subtraction, it's emptiness, it's that dichotomy. Painting is full of it. It starts right from the point where I can say, this is a girl in front of a building. Well, it's not. It's a piece of canvas with paint on it, so it's a lie. So we build on that lie, and we find ourselves in all sorts of dichotomies because of it. And that's the great thing about painting. It always has mysteries that unfold because of it. Now, with Scotty's work, you'll see that most of it is about that decay in some sort of way, but also about, I remember years ago Scotty saying to me, in all of his paintings he puts something life, Sometimes it'll be a building. Where is it in this one? I think there are some flowers down there. Yeah. So sometimes you have to look a little hard to find it, because it's never just a straight decaying building. There's always a sort of a positive thing, and it's also the way we look too. As you may not be aware of it, but as you walk down the street, if you see something alive, that's a focus point for you. Maybe it goes back to tribal hunting days or something like that. I don't know, but it's also a lovely positive thing to be putting into a painting which is about decay. And an extension of this is these paintings of Cuba that have the decaying past, which is sort of like the decaying revolution, and new positive signs in front of it, and it's that sort of dichotomy. Scotty calls the show, what's it called? Signs of Life, yeah. Which has got three different meanings to it from what I can see. One is, obviously, there are signs of life in all these paintings, but the other is the signs that you're seeing in a lot of them, old decaying Cuban signs from the revolution, and yet they have life in front of them somehow or other. So, and what was the third one I'm talking about? Well, yeah, it's basically those two things. It's Castro's signs and how that used to be a life, and also the new signs in front of them, basically the signs of new life. I'm not going to talk. I could talk for all afternoon if you want to. I've got a lot of notes. No, we should get on with drinking. Actually, we should get on with buying paint. I think probably I've done enough. Oh, one thing I should point out, because it's a bugbear of mine. I was talking about how after art school we found ourselves in the mainstream of painting somehow or other. And it's not something that people think about as being, that's their vision of what painting is. Most people think of painting, it's a bit like standing in front of an ocean and watching the waves come in. And here comes a new wave, and there are these people riding it, and we'll look for the next one, and these people have caught that, and maybe somebody will be really successful and get a really big wave and a really big... And so it's like looking at new activity, and everybody's looking for new art all the time. But I think it was when I used to listen to Lloyd Rees do various talks just like this, I got more of a feeling of art as a much bigger river than that. It's not just being on the edge of the shoreline. Sure, art needs to be defined by its shoreline somehow or other, but I think it's far more important for art to be involved in looking at the big fish out in the ocean, basically. And so the big fish that Scott is looking at here, obviously Vermeer, and people, you know, from like even Claude Lorrain. There's a long list of painters of light that I'm talking about that goes back to Rembrandt, Titian, and so on. You know? And that's the mainstream that I think painting should be focused on, rather than what's happening with the next wave, because that's about fashion, basically. You know? And I probably should leave it at that. I should declare the exhibition open.
Thank you, Bruce. And Scott, I'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Neil. That was absolutely wonderful. Look, it's just so great to see so many familiar faces and new faces here. I'm so appreciative of the effort everyone makes to come along to these shows. This has been an amazing journey for me with these Cuban works, and it'd be interesting to see where I go from here. I hope you enjoy your time looking at the stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask me. Thank you so much.
So continue to enjoy the exhibition. If you like Scott's paintings and you want to engage with a bit of Sign of Life, you should come and see me. Thanks.